morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. I want to take this opportunity to welcome all of you and just to inform all of you that you should feel welcome at home at this point. And just a brief introduction. This forum is a learning and exchange forum stemming from a project that is Operationalizing Just Transition in Africa project, which is done collaboratively by the Africa Research and Impact Network, University of Pretoria and South North in Cape Town. University of Pretoria is in Pretoria. And the principal investigator of this project is Dr. Ojta and Dr. Shanaz Musa, who is also the co-PI. So I want to take this opportunity to welcome Dr. Atela to officially introduce us to this particular forum, and then we will take it over from there. Welcome, Dr. Atela.
Right, thank you. So mine is just to also welcome you to this forum, Learning Exchange Forum on Just Transition, focusing on the nationally determined contributions of African countries. This debate is critical for us as a partnership or as a consortium, as Akinyi has mentioned, because the issues around just transition remain very critical in the pursuit for climate action within Africa. And the conversation around just transition basically builds on the fact that most African countries already have NDCs, which are basically, prioritizing the area of, for instance, energy as a key action sector, both especially for mitigation and for to some extent adaptation as well. And you realize that within the energy sector, there's a lot of focus to ensure that countries are moving from the fossil fuels into clean energy. And that transition is not an easy one, as written in the policies or in the documents. It's often quite complex because it involves a number of things. It involves a number of people in that space of moving from fossil fuels into clean energy. It involves a number of businesses who have actually been involved in the process of using fossil fuels, for instance, in Africa, in terms of industrialization. It involves a number of employed youths who really draw livelihoods from that particular space. It involves a number of governments who are actually passionate around building, sustainable or enhancing development of the African countries. So in that complexity, the big question we ask in this particular conversation is, how can we make that transition be just? And what are some of the pathways, through which that transition can be made much more equitable and, to be able to minimize or address some of the harmful effects that might come from that transition, people losing jobs, technologies being rendered redundant, infrastructure and assets being stranded. And all these could have a counterproductive effects on the well-being and, of course, the broader climate action, especially mitigation and adaptation. There are different, pathways that are important to think about. But for Africa, the question is which way? We talk about technologies which have been established. How do we transition technologies, from the dirty energy to now the clean energy? What are the opportunities for doing that? Financing, how do we ensure that, who finances that transition and any losses that are actually associated with that transition? We are talking about loss and damage funds. What kinds of opportunities that exist that, loss and damage funds and, of course, other funding could really support funding just transition issues or priorities. I mean, we are talking about the broader social issues, those who are affected, the marginalized, and all that. So in essence, this debate is very critical in the sense that it begins to unpack what is, the pathway that African countries should be able to or could take up or could pursue in terms of, implementing actions, especially in the energy space, to be able to meet the ambitions. And especially because those ambitions are underpinned in the NDCs, it is critical to really understand, more specifically, in the process of implementing those NDCs, how are we ensuring, what options exist to ensure that there is justice in the process? There's the bigger debate around, developing countries are not responsible for the greenhouse gas emissions, and also that developed countries developed by, adopting some of these fossil fuels. And so there's the wider justice at different levels, the global level, the international political level, at the national developmental aspiration level, but even at the communities or at the people level, where, people are likely to be entangled or are likely to be affected in one way or the other by the transition from dirty to clean energy. And therefore, this debate today, is very critical and marks a very important beginning of a discussion that helps us to really unpack some of these pathways. We, from the Africa Research and Impact Network, wrote a book recently, which was focusing on Africa's right to development in a carbon-constrained world. And there were so many theories that we brought up in terms of the different perspectives, some of which I've highlighted. So by having these discussions, we hope that we can unpack some of these questions further. And because we are anchoring these discussions, and of course, these discussions are inspired by our project around operationalizing the just transition pathways in Africa, supported by the IDRC, and of course, as Kenya said, implemented by South of North, ARIN ourselves, and of course, the University of Pretoria. We want to really engage with you. We want to listen to your thoughts, your experiences around this particular topic, so that we are able really to provide a holistic kind of unpacking of the situation, how it looks like, what are the opportunities, and to be able to inform the African continent on what pathways are existing and what are the implications of pursuing those pathways in sort of executing or pursuing just transition in their climate action, and particularly the energy sector. And for those and with those few remarks, Kinyi, I want to welcome the discussion and say that I look forward to the outcomes, or I look forward to the deliberations that will emerge from here.
Thank you very much, Dr. Atela, for those insightful words, opening remarks. At this moment, I want to welcome Engineer Stephen Zioka. Stephen joins us from the Ministry of Energy, and I just want him to explain, to give us just a general overview of the NDC landscape, policy landscape in Kenya, having actively participated in the NCAP implementation adoption process. So Stephen, please, over to you.
Thank you very much, Akinyi. I just want to highlight the target that we are given in the NDC, which was reviewed, and we are expecting it to go up to 2030. So for energy, you know that as a ministry, Vision 2030, we are looking at development through low carbon climate resilient development pathway. And we are implementing the NDC through the NCAPs. So through the NDC, we were given targets to increase renewables in the electricity generation mix of the national grid. And as a ministry, we are targeting to have 100% renewable in the mix by 2030. Currently, we are at 80% for installed capacity. And what we are consuming is more than 93%. Whatever is we are able to consume as a nation is 93%. So we are on track in the path to increase the renewables. Again, also, we have a mandate from the NDC to enhance energy and resource efficiency across the different sectors. So we look at energy efficiency, and as a ministry, we have a full-fledged department in charge of energy efficiency, where we are saying that according to the Kenya National Energy Electrification Strategy and Conservation Strategy, from 2020, we are looking at enhancing the energy efficiency by 2.8% annually, and increasing the number of equipment that need to have a label on energy efficiency from 4 to 10 across our equipments. Then we also are mandated to make progress towards achieving tree cover, especially on the water towers, which are leading to the hydro power generation dams. And I will explain what we are doing in terms of the NCAP targets. Again, also, we are mandated to have clean, efficient, and sustainable energy technologies to reduce our reliance on fossil fuels and non-sustainable biomass. And we also mandated to help the Ministry of Transport to have a low carbon and efficient transportation systems, and especially the e-mobility. So in our NCAP, which we developed 2023-2027, we have some actions that about 5 of them, 4 of them being mitigation and 1 on adaptation. The one on mitigation, the priority area is promoting clean, affordable, and quality alternative renewable energy sources. And the actions that we're supposed to undertake is to increase the number of energy centers who are disseminating energy, renewable energy technologies from 16 countrywide to 47, so that we have every county to have an energy center that can disseminate renewable energy technologies in the counties. And this is implemented through REREC, who are supposed to demonstrate energy interventions. Then on energy technologies between 2023 to 2027, we are supposed to demonstrate 195 energy efficient charcoal kilns that are developed. Again, also have biodigesters, small hydro plants, biofuel plants, wind masts, and data loggers, and ethanol production plants, and clean cooking solutions. On the same, we are looking forward between the same time to develop 589 megawatts of renewables between 2023 to 2027. Then the second priority area is enhancing electricity network expansion and improve electricity access in both on-grid and off-grid. I mentioned that we are at 80%, but the targets that we are given between now, it's to connect 2.3 additional customers and 30,000 public facilities to be connected through to have access. And then we are also given 90,000 transformers to be installed and maximized between 2023 to 2027. And again, also we are supposed to develop 150 mini grids and 50,473 standalone systems during the same period. And then we are also supposed to, because of efficiency, we are supposed to reduce losses in electricity transmission and distribution from 23% current to 16.5%. Because when we increase, we know that energy efficiency is one of the solutions to address climate change. So by increasing, reducing 1% of electricity transmission losses and distribution losses, we are able to save 1 billion Kenya shillings by just reducing 1% in electricity in the transmission system. The third priority area is promoting clean cooking and fuels, promoting clean cooking fuels and technologies. And the targets that we are given is through the climate action plan is to have 75% by 2027 having adopted modern cooking energy services, that is through LPG, e-cooking, biogas, and bioethanol. That is, again, also having 23% having cooking using improved cooking solutions, that is cooking stoves. Then we are looking at 5,000 public institutions transitioning to LPG during that time by installing 2-ton storage bullets and piping from bullet to gas burners in those schools. Then the fourth area that we are looking at mitigation is promoting geothermal energy for alternative use, because we know that hydro is very much affected by climate change. So we look forward to having more of geothermal coming on board, and again also commercializing the steam that is coming from the geothermal, which we vend most of the time, to be utilized by industries like grain dryers and again also cement manufacturing during that time. Then for mitigation, for adaptation, we have the climate-proof energy infrastructure as a target, as a priority area. And in this case, the actions that we have been given is to have 50% of new poles for distribution and transmission being concrete or eco poles. And this will help us to avoid use of tree poles in electricity reticulation and then avoid deforestation. So this is one of the most important areas that we are focusing on. Again, also on adaptation, we have been given a target of 2,500 hectares of water catchment areas being conserved and rehabilitated by protecting areas of feeding hydro generation reservoirs. And actually, currently, we have been assigned 100 million trees being grown in those areas. The target that we have been given under the 5 billion, is it the 5 or 15 billion trees in the country? The other one which we are looking forward to in adaptation is raising of Masinga Dam to enhance storage capacity by 1.5 meters, so that we increase the volume and increase the capacity of power generation. And in this area, we are looking at doing just transition by conducting environmental social impact assessment and drawing resettlement action plans, and so that we can be able to do the feasibility studies and designs and then enhance the dam capacity. So those are the areas that we have been given under the NCAP 2023-2027 to address the NDCs that are ending by 2030. Thank you. Back to you, Akinyi.
Once again, thank you very much, Engineer Stephen, for those very insightful remarks. And at this moment, I want to welcome Engineer. This session is full of engineers. Pardon me for that. But now we welcome Engineer Maxwell Ngala to give us his remarks on or generally on what you have for us today.
Thank you very much, Relia, and thanks, team, for the session. I'm quite sorry that on account of our commute from Kenya Power to this point has taken quite the time. But very happy that I've had Engineer Nzioka's submissions, I think very pivotal insofar as the ministry is concerned, as the guardian of policy and strategic direction with respect to these items. Perhaps then I can proceed. And we couldn't be discussing this, in my view, at a more opportune time. We are dealing with a multi-layer of crisis that necessitate global, concerted, and immediate action. And therefore, it really is important that we are able to crystallize the issues and properly pivot them, especially given that we have significant energy fragilities in this time. And these energy fragilities pronounce themselves especially because of in our economy, and because of particularly in the global south, with a history of development deficits. And so it then becomes a very critical discussion to have. So these were my remarks that I'd looked at sharing with us in this forum. And that really is it. My name is Maxwell Ngala. I'm a senior technical specialist with USAID Power Africa program called Empowering East and Central Africa. And previously I was at REREC, which is one of the agencies under in the Ministry of Energy. So I will quickly speak to some introductory elements in terms of, and this will be important because it will help us to understand through the lens of Power Africa. A bit of, I will zoom in to Kenya, but also zoom out a little and see what may be happening across the region. And then the critical elements in energy transition, and then the Kenya's energy sector, which already Engineer Zioka has spoken to very, very clearly. And then finally, we'll close out by saying one or two aspects then, because then this presentation assumed that the aspects that Engineer Zioka has discussed will follow. Power Africa really is this is the third iteration of Power Africa programs, and the focus for the Empowering East and Central Africa is on three areas. Number one is increasing connections throughout East and Central Africa, supporting the journey towards decarbonization, and so towards a carbon-free future. And finally, it is to crowd in private sector investment and involvement in energy and related fields. The particular program Empowering East and Central Africa covers those particular areas within the East and Central Africa region. So 14 countries in total, with a budget that covers 89 million to be utilized, 6 million in grants supporting productive use of energy, and 2 million in construction grants supporting especially the construction of mini-grids towards ensuring that no one is left behind. And the implementing agency is that, and of course the offices are within the country. So the lens for this, I think, and it's important that I set this out because then it shows us in the transition question, where do the various pockets of players fit in? So within Power Africa, then there are several work streams, but these 6 work streams are very important. One is access to finance, which unlocks opportunities for businesses, especially the private sector, to be involved in moving the needle, as it were. So under access to finance, we work with a lot of private sector entities. We work with the public sector and participants in the space, whether it is in regional fundraising or it is in investor readiness support, and just to be able to ensure that there is sufficient working capital to sustain and to promote the uptake of 1, productive use, 2, solar home systems, 3, mini-grids, and other flavors when it comes to energy access. Then there's business performance improvement, which through which window we as Power Africa support entities in growth that would be looking at unlocking certain very particular elements about business. Is it training, capacity building? How then do we structure ourselves around the transition? Then market dynamics or market intelligence support, which rides on market assessments that we conduct across our 14 countries of interest. And these market assessment reports basically give intelligence on the opportunities, the policies, the programs, the partnerships that then can be utilized and taken advantage of to ensure that we are able to achieve our program target of 11.5 million on-grid and off-grid connections, and to also unlock investments in clean energy generation. Then policy and regulatory support, cross-sectoral, this is very critical, particularly in the spirit of energy transition, ensuring that no one is left behind. So gender equality and social inclusion, whether it's in community engagement, and those of us in Kenya will understand, at least in the backdrop of the last few days, the critical question of public participation and the involvement of citizenry in the execution of the agenda of the day then is very critical. And therefore, we also in the spirit of that transformative charter, the Constitution of Kenya and many other constitutions across our regions really emphasize the need for us to be participatory and inclusive. Then technical engineering assistance, which is feasibility studies and many other things, and that will unlock funds and opportunities. Basically, the idea is to end energy poverty, to accelerate a carbon-free future, strengthen and expand grids to deliver more energy to end users, and to bolster energy sector investment and innovation. Because the energy transition will involve all the sector players. All the players will have to be, all hands will have to be on deck. And especially if we look at a country like Kenya and its commitments that my friend has already spoken to, then even more critically, then the private sector would need to be involved. So then when we look at energy transition, the windows through which we look at this are those at least 6 items. Traditionally, we've looked at this through 4 windows, but right now the question is around decarbonization. How do we accelerate to meet our targets while ensuring that there's reliability, stability of supply, and that all the indices towards security are adhered to? This is particularly important for grid electrification. When we look at the spate of blackouts that we've had in the previous year, about 3 of them national blackouts, then this underscore the need for decarbonization while also ensuring that we are able to maintain and sustain very high reliability indices across our offerings. Then there's digitalization, which has to do with data and more data from energy systems, better performance and decision making, smart grids, smart networks. This basically will lend itself ultimately to loss reduction, will lend itself to a more efficiency in terms of operations. This will translate ultimately to lower costs of operation and therefore lower cost for electricity and power. Then there is democratization, which has to do with trying to make the market as dynamic as possible. Think about open access regulations that EPRA just published the other day with respect to Kenya, the open access electricity market and bulk supply regulations. They speak to a more democratized electricity supply chain, and it is a more open and transparent market where all the players have a level playing field. You have a system operator, for example, if you look at electricity, or you have a regulator who is not a player within that space, but who ensures then that there's good visibility and networking. Then there's decentralization, which is again a very key element, which has to do with distributed and decentralized energy systems, mini grids of all flavors, standalone PV systems, microgrids, all those which are co-located with the load, and basically to ensure that we are able to onboard as many as possible. Where it becomes infeasible technically or not viable economically to extend the grid, then these pockets of persons then can be onboarded in a manner that will be participatory, especially when we consider those who are under the grid, those who are within beyond 2 kilometers away from the grid, those are properly off grid, and even those who may be under the grid or within grid areas, but the stability of supplies is not very good, or there are many other reasons then that would attract the idea of decentralization. Finally, it's electrification, and this really is the decade of electrification. This is a moment because the electricity generated by renewables is very critical, and it's going to be this decade, what is going to define our operations is how we generate and deploy energy and electricity particularly. So, and this is where either there is direct electrification or indirect through vectors like hydrogen, battery energy storage systems, which especially when we look at those hard to abate areas that require much more innovative approaches. That is in terms of aviation, shipping, and many other lines. Finally, it's efficiency. Efficiency is really the mother of them all in the sense that if we are able to reduce waste, if we are able to be more conscious of our utilization of energy, then we can be able to achieve much more, in fact, in a shorter time. So how then do we move from here to there? And what I propose, what I say is the strategy, the work we have to do must be in line with 4S implementation strategy: speed, scale, sustainability, and systemic transformation. That what we have to do must be of a level and of such quanta that they will be consequential. It will be consequential, not just within Kenya, but within the region. If you look at regional power pools that are transforming the way people do work, that are unlocking opportunities for renewable energy across the region and across the continent, Africa's single electricity market, the Continental Energy Master Plan, and all these things, they speak to a way that we can rapidly move from pilots, and we can move to a place where now we are deploying at scale. Then the speed of transactions, the speed with which we do this, because 2030 is our end game. Many of the things converge within a few short years from now. Therefore, that which we do then must be geared very quickly towards a target. Then, of course, sustainability, which is the true north. And this must be systemic. It must be in such a manner that it impacts not just people, but processes, procedures, policies. It is embedded really in the soul and the DNA of organizations. Nzioka has already spoken to this, I think, very well. Where are we today with respect to, for example, Kenya? This data is from Climate Scope. You could also look at the data from EPRA. EPRA's data slightly has the figures lower, but Kenya's generates 87% of its electricity from renewables. The latest EPRA statistics report 2023 December put this to about 85%. And geothermal is accounting for 40% and large hydro accounting for 27%. You can look at that growth trajectory in about 10 years, 129% increment or growth in terms of our installed capacity. This is significant, especially when we look at the renewable energy component of the installed capacity, which is about 80% as well. 77% to 80% in that bracket. Kenya is leading in geothermal, not just in Africa, but in the continent, in the world globally. I think about number 7 or so in the indices, with our capacity now about 940 megawatts of installed capacity. Kenya also is leading in solar. I think the largest solar power plant within the region in Eastern Central Africa, the Garissa Solar Power Plant by REREC, and now being run by KenGen, was a significant foundational project, because then it has opened. We now have CDET, we have Selen-K, we have Malindi Solar, close to 210 megawatts of on-grid capacity. But and then of course, Kenya is leading, also taking thought leadership in wind power. 300 megawatts of Lake Turkana wind power, which is easily one of the biggest within the region. So 310 megawatts. This is significant. If you look at the graphs I've shared there, you can see the shrinking column for oil and diesel, and you can see a corresponding increase in geothermal. You can see an increase in solar PV. You can see an increase in wind capacities. And going into the future, as we march towards 2030, our interest is to keep watch on those aspects and try also and onboard small hydro and biomass, of which a good number in the latest edition of the Least Cost Power Development Plan. And this, we believe, will be able to unlock much more in the clean generation. That is one of the foundational aspects in terms of climate mitigation in our NDC. So Vision 2030 is targeting 100% renewable energy by 2030. We're also targeting 100% universal access by 2030. So 2030 is really the point of convergence of many programs. Even Power Africa will be converging around 2030. So the math must add up. The simulation must converge. By 2030, all factors held constant, we will be looking at significant developments happening, not just within the country, but indeed within the continent. Allow me then quickly, I will gloss over this in the interest of time, but the fastest growing electrification rate in Africa, Kenya, Kenya is a significant market. We are making rapid progress on the back of solar home systems, on the back of rapid grid expansion projects by Kenya Power, KETRACO on the electricity, on the transmission side, REREC, and I will show a slide then next on the roles of these various agencies. But the percentage of citizens with access to electricity is rising and growing at a rate that is very exciting, especially for us on this call. You can see the Sub-Saharan Africa average and the East African average. We are significantly above the indices for those other for the region and for Sub-Saharan Africa. It's an important metric because Sub-Saharan Africa, a lot of interventions are happening here. The World Bank through the Kenya Off-Grid Solar Access Project, focusing in Kenya, but the World Bank through the Ascent program that is focusing in a much wider plate, is looking at how to then onboard more persons on the train. So since 2010, energy access for Kenya's total population has risen from 19.2% to 75% in 2023. And the two main strategies, if you look at the Kenya National Electrification Strategy, then this will be revealed. You have grid expansion, ambitious targets by the utility Kenya Power. I looked at the latest EPRA statistics. In 2023 alone, Kenya Power onboarded 414,000, close to 415,000 new customer connections. The total customer base is about 9.5 million. And this is through ambitious last mile connectivity project. Then on the off-grid side, because the theme really here is the transition, and how then do we ensure that no one is left behind? On the off-grid, we have REREC, we have private mini-grid players, we have SHS companies, solar home system companies, we have very innovative products in the market, RBF facilities, that's results-based financing, and many other such targeted facilities that have also led to significant improvement. This is really it. I think this is something I think we are all familiar with. I will not revisit it, but it's a structure of the power system in Kenya, power sector in Kenya, and how then we can be able to, who does what and what is critical in us making that movement towards 2030 and the lofty expectations of that time. We have the various agencies. I think the most critical thing here I wish to observe is really the important role of the Ministry of Energy and Petroleum as the custodian of the vision, the custodian of the strategy, EPRA in regulation, the Energy and Petroleum Tribunal, and also in between there, the Renewable Energy Resource Advisory Council or Committee, which then has CEOs for many of these entities that basically just ensures that there is good stewardship, first of the water towers and good stewardship of the other renewable energy resources. So that then as we speak about mitigation, then we also lend ourselves to the more proactive question about adaptation. So I will not revisit this. I will quickly move on with the understanding that this KETRACO's role, Kenya Power's role, REREC, which appears in both streams, both as a generator and as a distributor, Kenya Power family as a distributor, and the many IPPs that participate in this. These are important because of the private sector involvement. So where are we going in terms of demand projections? This is where I've used here the Least Cost Power Development Plan for 2021, 2030. But the ministry I know will soon, hopefully soon, will be able to share the latest edition of this 2024, 2043, which I had the privilege of being part of the technical committee on. And it's the idea here is that under the reference scenario, the vision scenario is the most ambitious of this, targeting the very lofty expectations of Vision 2030. But the reference scenario looks at 5.2% annual growth rate in demand. Remember, while we talk about growth in generation, onboarding more clean generation, we must also talk about the corollary or the what follows, which is the growth in demand, which is very important for utilities to remain afloat, very important for private sector to be involved and to crowding resources and funds. KETRACO is planning to extend the grid with over 4.6 kilometers, 4,600 kilometers of new transmission lines. There are many off-grid projects. There are projects within C&I, that's the commercial and industrial sector. I would be happy to inform us, team, that the commercial and industrial sector in Kenya is rapidly growing. We are now at 449 megawatts of clean generation in captive power generation, CPG or C&I. This is very, very positive because this has grown over time, and the Electricity Sector Association of Kenya, ESSAC, published a baseline study which is targeting 1 gigawatt of clean captive generation again by 2030. Please note, the golden strand, as it is said, all roads lead to Rome. It appears all targets converge by 2030. So it's really important, those 4 S's: scale, speed, sustainability, and systemic change that will deliver this. This I will not speak much to, because these are things domiciled within the Least Cost Power Development Plan. Geothermal, we continue to leverage on our, when we speak about the nuances for Kenya, it is to leverage on where we have a competitive advantage. Geothermal continues to be significant and important, spearheaded by KenGen. And not just geothermal, but what are the opportunities for what we are calling industrial parks? My colleague has just talked to this. There are private sector players that are now willing, on the back of open access regulations and all these things, they are willing to, once this is operationalized and the market is properly, the guidelines are clear on the pricing and all this, they would be willing to onboard generation that would be serving directly certain industrial parks, whether these industrial parks will be in green fertilizer or ammonia, or these industrial parks will be focusing on carbon capture and storage, or any other trucks. Then hydropower, I think this is a critical one. Wind, again, very important for us. Solar and battery energy storage systems, because of the need then for us to also maintain a stable grid and stable supply, in a movement to try and make these renewables as firm as possible. So then this will be some of those things that we'll be keeping track on. In terms of mini grids, now that I've taken quite an amount of time speaking about grid and how to move towards a decarbonized grid, how to move towards digital grid and smart grids. There are many mini grids that are also under development. I think the most resilient mini grid player, you see the screen in front of you, the ones that are most resilient today, Kudura Power East Africa and Ruvia have projects under development within the humanitarian settlements in up north in Turkana. The rest of these have mini grids that are have been developed, and they are operating and running them. Again, in terms of the pipeline of projects, very significant that we have quite a number of them coming up. REREC and Kenya Power working on the Kenya Off-Grid Solar Access project. This project should be able to turn at least 120 mini grids just across those two organizations, and to onboard over 15,000 customer connections, which is very important. There are other community organizations that are onboarding mini grids. And remember, this is more in displacement, because where people previously were using oil, diesel, and so on, then the general movement now is towards new alternative energy, whether it's bioenergy, whether it's solar or medium speed wind turbines, and so on. So this is there. And other than mini grids, of course, now are solar home systems, and the list continues. Allow me to quickly then bring this to a close. I have already talked about the C&I industry and sector, and which is really, whose growth is underpinned by growth in solar PV, bioenergy, and in waste heat recovery. This and also some track for hydro, small hydros, and so on. This will continue to be an important track, especially as we keep track on industrialization. So the key players in the C&I sector are there. And the key drivers include, of course, decreased dependency on the grid. There's a lot more grid defections because of reliability, stability of supply. There is the cement farms that simply cannot accept a downtime. And therefore, it is important then that they take that. And the top 5 industries projected to uptake this is agriculture, metallurgy, in hospitality and tourism, energy, and finally in foreign missions and NGOs. Now for transmission scale projects, allow me to skip this in the interest of time, but we will discuss it then at another stage. But these are all plans. And remember, the idea here is grid expansion, to further develop and modernize our grid. We need then to be able to, regardless of where these clean energy technologies are being developed, we need to find a way of quickly evacuating or transporting the power from the generation to the load centers. So then there are major movements in the world now under the One Solar, One World, One Grid, which is championed by the Indian government. There is a Green Grid initiative in Europe. And within here, of course, there's a lot of support from development partners to work on the regional power pool, the East Africa power pool, which then also will be further connected to the West African power pool, to the Southern African power pool. And all this will lead to the opportunity for us to deploy at scale and to accelerate the impact. Quickly on e-mobility, this is a pet subject, I think. In these discussions, I think when we talk about decarbonization, we cannot ignore transport. This will be an important part. I will not visit everything around it, but the critical element is the fact that there's been a lot of work in the sector. EPRA just published the market assessment for 2- and 3-wheelers. Before this, the E-Mobility Association of Kenya published their sector white paper on policy reforms and initiatives that they believe will be important for the adoption of electric vehicles. And there's an assortment of activities that are gathering storm as we move towards 2030. There were concerns with the bill, the Finance Bill 2024, but that since has been overtaken by events. We hope then that the environment will continue to be conducive, because by 2025, Kenya is aiming through the NDCs to account for 5%. EVs should be accounting for 5% of all newly registered vehicles. This is my last slide, and it is just to put all this again back together, that the need for us to abate greenhouse emissions by 32% by 2030 will require us to focus on, of course, we're focusing on energy, but there are industrial processes and product use, energy in agriculture, energy in transport, energy in all these other streams that will be important. The broader context is a Vision 2030, which is our true north as a country. Now we have the bottom-up economic transformation agenda and the 4th medium-term plan of the Vision 2030. We had the budget policy statement that was read not too long ago that made also very bold commitments towards funding climate interventions. Then the Ministry of Energy has worked with Sustainable Energy for All on the Energy Transition Investment Plan 2023 to 2050. There's a gender policy that the ministry has worked on, the Kenya Ethanol Cooking Fuel Master Plan, Climate Investment Funds, RE Integration Program Investment Plan for Kenya. This is a foundational context through which we will have to be looking at this. If you look at agriculture, REDEC, for example, is working on the Galana Kulalo Food Security Electrification Project. That's an important one because these are projects that have been using diesel to power their infrastructure. And now, through clean energy from Malindi Solar Power Plant, it's going to be possible, and really the entirety of the grid, it's going to be possible to power agriculture in that very extensive farm. If you look at industries in all flavors and in all forms, if you look at transport in terms of e-mobility, then there is great things that are happening. So finally, in terms of mitigation, this is where I sit, from where I sit, in increasing renewable energy generation mix in the national grid. Then there is the ones, I think right now we've been impacted by the moratorium on the signing of PPAs and so on. When this is lifted, then it will easily unlock about 1,000 gigawatts of generation, clean generation, that will be onboarded on the grid. I think that's an exciting prospect. EPRA is doing a commendable job in the development of the regulations to back this up. The ministry is working very well with partners on the green hydrogen strategy, on the INEP, and in updating the national energy policy, in the electrification strategy, the least cost power development plan. All this will help to further situate that particular ambition of increasing RE in the generation mix. In terms of enhancement of energy and resource efficiency, the National Energy Efficiency and Conservation Strategy and Plan is guiding us in that direction. And we have the clean cooking strategy, the bioenergy strategy, that is onboarding the very important track of clean cooking. If you look at the work that the Clean Cooking Association of Kenya is doing, it is pivotal in this respect. So thank you very much, team. I think I just wanted to put a comma here and to say that the work that we are going to have to do, we'll have to have the nuances or the accents, to borrow words from one of our CSS before. We'll have to carry those nuances and accents that are authentically Kenyan. And this, I think, will be one of those things that we will be able to do if we harness the opportunity and focus on the renewable energy track. So this, I think, will be pivotal and will be very important in us making that transition at speed, scale, and in a manner that is sustainable and that will be systemic. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Max, for those very insightful information. And clearly, what we've actually learned from this, what I've personally learned from this is that there's really need for increased availability of and access to affordable clean energy, and that is for just energy transition. And this involves, as you correctly mentioned, various aspects that involves including decarbonization, digitalization, talk about democratization, talk about decentralization, electrification, and efficiency. And you've also mentioned several other issues, channels under which these can be implemented. And that ties into what Engineer Nzioka had talked about previously. That includes for effective just energy transition. We need to increase Kenya's tree cover, and not just Kenya, but also other countries as well. Increase the tree cover, reduce electricity distribution losses and all that. And one key aspect that has so far from all these presentations that have so far been missing out is how do we actually now bring on board the financing aspects? How do we finance just energy transition? And this now a very perfect segue to what now Ruben is going to talk to us about. Ruben, over to you to talk to us about how exactly can we finance renewable energy activities and projects generally in Kenya and also in Africa. Over to you, Ruben.
Thank you very much. And first of all, I want to appreciate for inviting me today to be able to share about financing. I think the first place to naturally start is when I got the invite around this topic of just energy transition financing. The reality is that, as we've heard from the engineers, is that, for example, if you look at Kenya with the energy transition and investment plan, we really have a very huge financing need. And given the context of the invite as I received it, I thought it would be useful, for the purposes of this session to actually, just give context and set the scene on what the financing need looks like, together with the different instruments that are available for use. And also in setting the scene, mention about the need to harness private sector finance. And while I know we could have further deep dives on private sector finance, you are going to realize as we go through the presentation why the issue of private sector finance becomes extremely important in the discussion about just energy transition financing. So by way of introduction, I'm Ruben Muhindo Mboi. I'm a climate finance specialist with Climate Shapers Africa, which is an advisory firm that works with different institutions, including banks and central banks on how to think about transition financing and green finance. And I'm also the founder of Kenya Climate Directory. You can check it out, Google Kenya Climate Directory, which is the national repository for all published works on climate and nature-related topics in Kenya. So to set the scene of this, last year during the Africa Climate Summit, we did a study to look at what are the key barriers for just climate transition in Africa. And Kinyo, when I got your invite, I thought this was very timely. And while we were looking at, which are the different, barriers for just climate transition in Africa, we found these 5 buckets in which these barriers could fall. So the first 2 buckets relate to what you'll call, challenges in the public finance space, which is like, the money that is available to governments for financing. And the other one relates to, the other 3 relates to what I'll call non-public finance. So I'm talking about private sector financing and other forms of financing. On the public sector side, for a lot of economies, we have very high levels of debt, which of course complicates the financing that could be available using, government or like just budgetary support to fund energy. And of course, we have very inadequate climate action funding, because if we look at the commitment, say, of the $100 billion that was made, at COP, during following the Paris Agreement, we are still seeing underinvestment. Then the next 3 buckets, there is the issue about high risk perception. There's a very high risk perception, and this affects the cost of, capital. Especially in African markets and other developing countries, like, if you look at Southeast Asia, and issues of currency fluctuations. The reason this is super important is because a lot of the investments in energy in a lot of our markets is dollar denominated or foreign currency denominated. And of course, there's very limited private sector involvement in terms of the financing. So this helps us to get an idea of, the different buckets in which this financing for just transition looks like. So in 2015, just to remind us, after the SDGs framework came to be, UNCTAD, which is the UN Agency on Trade and Development, they estimated that we required $2.5 trillion in developing countries every year in order to meet the need for SDGs in developing countries. So last year, UNCTAD did a similar study and said, okay, what does the gap look like now? And from that analysis, the current gap is 4 trillion to finance the SDGs. And as you can tell, energy alone accounts for 2.2 trillion in developing countries. So more than half of the investment need to meet SDG financing is in the energy sector. And if you look at the next 2 sectors, water and sanitation and infrastructure, in a sense, these are 2 sectors which are also what I would call energy related. So if you combine energy, water and sanitation and infrastructure, and all this, you call them energy related, you're looking at 3.1 trillion out of 4 trillion. So this is saying more than 75% of the capital investment that is required to meet the SDG is going to come from energy-related investments. And this is a really huge point as you think about just transition in Africa. And of course, you see social sectors like health and education, the investment is really low. Not that they're not important, but it's because a lot of sectors in the social space like health and education, a lot of the investment required is operational. So operational expenditure, paying salaries, paying health workers, as opposed to capital investments. And I'm going to share these slides at the end of the presentation. So, you're going to feel free to read them and look at them further. And now a quick question comes in. If the need in 2015 was 2.5 trillion, and the need as at last year is 4 trillion, what has happened? Is it that we have had an additional need over the 8 years, or is it that we have had underinvestment happening? Because realize the goal is still by 2030. So by 2015, we had 15 years to go. By 2023, end of last year, we had 7 years to go. And this analysis from UNCTAD shows that a lot of the underinvestment a lot of the gap we are seeing in terms of meeting our SDGs is actually as a result of underinvestment. And the biggest underinvestment is in the energy space, with an underinvestment of 1.1 trillion in developing countries. So the key message from this slide is to actually say that while there is a huge need in investment in energy, it also means that the current investment is not happening at the pace that it could be happening. Now, if we look at Kenya, and engineer has mentioned this, we have the energy transition and investment plan for Kenya that estimates that we are going to require 600 billion. And if we open up this 600 billion in terms of investment and just look at which are the different subsectors within it, we realize that transport, and here we were talking about e-mobility, is gonna account for at least 57% or close to 60% of that investment, followed by power and hydrogen for about 30%. And then industry and clean cooking, around 11–10%. But here the point is to say that just looking at transport and power alone, investments in transport and power in Kenya are going to require at least 90% of the 600 billion that is required. And a lot of this is being driven by income and population growth. And of course, we are seeing a shift to more capital intensive, low carbon technologies, which is a discussion we just had about renewable energy. Now, the question is, if this is the case, what is the state of financing as we currently speak? A lot of the climate finance that we see in the continent, 65% is from grants. And the rest is everything else, from your concessional loans to your market debt to everything else, which means that we are seeing very little commercial capital, or a lot of a very huge gap in terms of the private capital space within financing of the energy needs that we have. Now, we mentioned the issue of NDCs, which have been mentioned. So if you look at, and I'm happy here to give a view, from a continental perspective. If you look at the NDC needs for climate finance as a continent level, which is a total climate finance you see, versus how much capital is actually flowing, we see that there's a very huge financing gap in terms of the need. For example, if you look at the 227 billion versus what is actually flowing. So that is the key message number one from this slide. But the other thing that we're actually saying is that even from the little that is flowing into financing the NDCs, a huge chunk is actually coming from public capital or from government budgets. And we are seeing very little private finance flows. And this is not biased by region. If you take these numbers and just cut them by the different regions of the continent, the picture is the same. The flows versus the NDCs, we are seeing huge gaps, with the largest gaps being in Southern Africa and East Africa. And collectively, these two sub-regions of the region have a lot of the, highly developed countries, if you exclude Egypt and Nigeria in terms of the energy needs. A lot of them are in Southern Africa and East Africa. So here the point is to say that the NDC gap is huge in terms of financing, but even the current financing, a lot of it is still coming from the public purse. And this is the same story across the continent. Now, let's now take Africa. And here, this slide has two messages. Let's take Africa and say, if we have very little private capital financing, what does the story look like in the other regions of the world? So in Africa, as you see, the extent of private financing that is going to total climate finance is 14%. And in Southeast Asia, it's 36%. But if you look at the other extreme, US and Canada, the climate finance space is hugely coming from private investment, or private investments. What this is telling us is that it is not the case that transition financing has to be financed using the public budget, and that what we are seeing is just this disproportionality is mostly happening in Africa and Southeast Asia. And this is a problem because these are the same regions of the world where governments are most constrained in terms of their budget. So what we are saying with the graph you're seeing on the left is that the regions in the world that are most constrained in terms of government budget, they are the same regions of the world where a lot of the climate finance is coming from the public purse and very little coming from private investments, which highlights the need. Now, to the question about financing, then we see, let's take this 14%, which is coming from private finance, and let's open it up and ask ourselves, where is this private finance being absorbed within the continent? If you open that up, you realize 74% of this very limited private finance is going to energy systems or energy-related investments. So the key message here is to say, the limited private capital or the limited private investment you're seeing in Africa is not an absorption problem. There is capacity to absorb that investment, and the energy sector has proved capable of absorbing this investment, which means if we were today to double the private investment going into climate finance or climate mitigation adaptation, the energy sector would be able to absorb it, because even with the very limited capital, we have seen that energy systems, they have very huge absorption capacity. So no one should say that the reason we are seeing very low financing is because of problems of absorption. That is not the case. There is very huge absorption capacity within the sector. And now we say, take the energy investment across Africa, and what we want to do is take the entire need in Africa, and depending on different organizations' capacity, let's allocate this need by the different players. And if we were to allocate the climate finance need in Africa by the different actors, we would realize that corporations would have, at least if they were to pull their weight, they would finance 28% of the transition. Commercial financial institutions, which is the orange, would cater for the 12%. Households and individuals would cater from the 11%, which is like, paying from your pocket. Infrastructure funds will cater for 3%. DFIs would cater for 18%. State-owned enterprises would cater for 17%. Government budget would do the 10%, and multilateral climate funds would do the 1%. But what we are seeing currently is that we have an inverted financing mechanism, because as I have shown from the very first slide, is that a lot of the investment is actually coming from government, which is already constrained, and multilateral climate funds through the grants. So it means corporations and commercial financial institutions combined, they would have to finance 40% of this gap. And as we have seen, very little is coming from private financing. And that is a story that we are saying, that the need for energy investments from private sources remains hugely underfunded and hugely unattended, since a lot of these private finance players, they are not pulling their weight, and we will shortly see why. And of course, on the right again is just to show you that by region, as I had showed you before. Now, I want to dispel one myth that people say, oh, actually, there's a lot of private capital flowing into energy. It's only that this money or this financing is not well tracked. And this slide is telling us that the problem, the challenge we are seeing in just energy financing is not a tracking problem. So what this slide tells you is the different sources of financing and how well they are trackable. So if it's energy systems, we realize that the private investment that goes into energy systems is hugely tracked or hugely trackable. So anyone saying that we have huge private investment going into energy and it's a tracking problem, that is not the case. In fact, energy systems have one of the highest form of trackability. And as you can see, again, for public international, so the last category, public international finance, of course, that will be donor funding because it's coming from public finance, which is governments, and also this is international government. So this is donor funding. And of course, you can see a lot of orange because donors, are probably better at tracking their finance flows than the private sector and the public domestic, which is now domestic government. So this is to actually say that we actually have a challenge of actual investments, and the challenge is not in terms of tracking the investment flows. And before I say into what we need to do for this, this is another last chart I wanted to show you of saying, now, if you were to take the different financiers of climate finance transition and what form of instrument that they are actually employing, you will realize, for example, for multilateral development finance institutions, a lot of it is coming, of course, from project level financing, which is the 54%. And then we have low cost project debt, which is the concessional finance. So those combined are, more than 80%. And then the rest is from grants and equities. But if you look at the private players on this chart, so look at corporations, for example, a lot of the corporations, which are the private companies, a lot of the investment they are doing is equity, their own investments. Maybe it's low tech technology. Maybe they are doing their own renewable energy investments. If you look at commercial financial institutions at the bottom, you still realize a lot of it is like this low cost project debt and equity. And here the point is to say there is very little balance sheet financing coming from the private sector. And ideally what we want as we head into 2030 is to actually invert this so that we can see more project level financing coming from the private players, because that is where the huge potential is. Remember from what I showed you above in terms of what the potential is for each of the different actors in this space. And just to back up this particular slide is to say, if you look at the different instruments, and I don't want us to get confused or interpret this, the way you interpret this is to say, if you do climate finance, climate financing, you can either put it into adaptation, mitigation, or both benefits, which are the different instruments that are being used, whether grants or low-cost project debt or project-level financing, which is we want most of it, or equity or balance sheet financing, and which are the sectors. Again, these tell the same story, that we have very huge needs in adaptation and mitigation. A lot of the instruments so far are still in use of grants and concessional loans, and the sector still getting a lot of the investment is energy. So if there was a way to even double or triple or quadruple private investment, there's still huge absorption capacity within the energy sector. So the question asks, then why are we not seeing private financing? And one thing we've realized from where I sit, having been involved in the Africa Climate Summit study on what are these transition barriers, and having been involved in the UNCTAD study of sizing the SDG investment gap, it's mostly an issue about the efficiency of our capital markets. One, there's an issue about bankable projects. There's a very limited number. But I always qualify that by asking, is it actually true? Because there are a lot of bankable projects within the market, only that they probably are not well packaged in a way that makes them attractive to investors. And engineers spoke earlier about, having like a project readiness facility or a project preparation facility. Then lack of orderly markets in terms of regulation. Some of African markets, they don't have very well established capital markets. Lack of sufficient intermediaries. And by this, I mean, you find a lot of intermediaries or a lot of the project developers or asset managers doing a lot of these projects. It's actually foreign players. We have very few, domestic intermediaries in capital markets in Africa. We don't have a diversified investor base. And of course, the last one, and we've seen in Kenya a lot of this, there's this crowding out effect. We just have a lot of private investments, especially from banks, going to lending to government as opposed to going to private financing of energy projects. That being the case, one thing that could really help is around coming up with de-risking financing mechanisms. And this is just a schematic example to say, we need financing mechanisms like guarantees, where you say, if, for example, there is capital to invest in a project and there's an early stage project, say in a renewable energy project in some remote part of this country, having public capital, instead of putting that public capital or that public investment or that DFI investment into the project, we could use this public capital to actually come up, say, with a guarantee fund or a guarantee mechanism or a foreign exchange de-risking mechanism or a foreign exchange guarantee scheme or a credit enhancement model for a bank, whatever that looks like. And use this public capital, use this DFI capital just to de-risk. Because what we have seen is that if any project has a huge de-risking element to it, then it makes easier to convince private investors like banks to put in their money. Because as we know, capital is very shy. But if you have proper de-risking mechanisms, and then you now go to private financiers and say, look, as government, we are going to de-risk this. As a DFI, we are going to offer de-risking capital. Then the possibility or the likelihood of investment goes up. So in summary, what I would say is the following, just to, because of the time limit, is 5 things that I have mentioned. One is that we have a very huge SDG financing gap. We've seen that energy accounts for over 50% of the SDG investment gap. If you use Kenya as an example, for instance, the Energy Transition Investment Plan requires 600 billion in capital investment. 2 is that the private sector energy financing is really low, and there's a very huge gap, although we have a very huge absorption capacity for this. And this huge financing gap is compounded by high risk perception. There's very high risk perception. One example I like mentioning is that when Ghana defaulted on its sovereign bond, the yield on Kenya's Euro bond actually shot up. Yet this was something happening in Ghana, but because markets just perceive us as one region, as if we have one risk profile, this risk perception becomes very, it complicates the dynamics for private capital. And of course, this increases the high cost of capital. I have mentioned again that we have these market barriers, which make it difficult for private capital financing. But again, number 4 is that one thing that we could actually aim for is to have public finances and DFIs come in just to offer de-risking investment mechanisms. Because if we have de-risking mechanisms, this can actually make projects that are otherwise not bankable to be bankable. And also it can help to mobilize market rate private capital for investments that would otherwise not be able to be financed, especially when the moratorium on, for example, PPPs in Kenya is lifted. And finally, some of these innovative financing mechanisms that can be used for this just energy financing include, use of like credit guarantees. So you offer credit guarantees to private players. If it's in terms of the risk that comes from foreign exchange, we can have an FX guarantee facility. Also for early stage projects, we can have a first loss guarantee fund, and we have a couple of funds doing first loss guarantees. You can do credit enhancement. I have seen it work in South Africa with the Development Bank of South Africa, and also things like project preparation facilities. Yeah, so in short is to say that the gap for just energy transition financing is real. It actually exists. But if we use innovative financing mechanisms, there is actually room to actually mobilize private capital, and there's room for public finance and DFI finance to actually offer de-risking mechanisms in order to make renewable energy investments more attractive to private players. So I'll stop at that, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ruben, for those wonderful remarks. And this now segues us to the Q&A session, which I hope that I have seen a number of questions to some of our panelists. And the first question, especially my first question, I'll kick it off. My first question goes to Ruben. You correctly mentioned that some some of the key financing barriers include unsustainable debt. And you also correctly mentioned that one of the ways in which we can achieve a just energy transition is through the de-risking, adopting some of these financing mechanisms such as guarantees. But then the challenge that I have with guarantees, especially public guarantees, is that they tend to have an impact on a country's public debt levels. So how do you create that balance between ensuring that you have state guarantees and also ensuring that the debt levels that are a country's particular debt levels are also at optimal stage or rather level? And my other question is how do you also ensure that some of the financing mechanisms that you have identified actually achieve the intended benefits that are hoped for, especially for the vulnerable communities? And here I am looking at, I'm particularly asking for some of the barriers that you have identified that are actually visible when implementing some of these locally led adaptation financing mechanisms. And the other question that I have for Engineer Ngala, you correctly mentioned that since 2010, Kenya has had the fastest growing electrification rate in Africa. But what does this mean for the vulnerable communities? What are some of the ethical issues that are arising whenever renewable energy projects are being implemented? And here I'm looking at particularly the Lake Turkana wind power project, which raised a number of issues, including environmental impact assessment that was shoddily done. I'm looking at the human rights impact assessment that was also shoddily done. In fact, for this particular project, the World Bank was one of the initial stakeholders, but then due to the impact assessment that the World Bank conducted, the World Bank withdrew from the project. But then now, how do you create a balance between achieving a just energy transition and also ensuring that the economic aspects that you would hoping to derive from these particular projects are also met? And my final question to Engineer Nzioka, the capacity gaps that have so far been visible or been that you've so far identified while implementing some of these renewable energy related nationally determined commitments. What are some of these capacity needs that you think that some of the private sectors, or not just the private sector, but also other key stakeholders in the just energy transition era, how do they come in? What are how can they come in to assist the Ministry of Energy, the Ministry of Environment, the National Treasury, to address some of these capacity needs that you think that are really need to be filled? So there are also other questions that are on the chart, and I see one from Lavender. Thank you, Engineer Maxwell, for that insightful presentation, especially on the just energy transition. One of the key points I noted is the aspect of achieving 100% renewability within Kenya by 2030. One critical issue that I need to seek clarification on is the use of critical minerals, which also plays a very crucial role in the development and deployment of renewable energy technologies and energy storage solutions. Kindly elaborate more on how feasible this is and how sustainable will this be, especially in the e-mobility sector. We can start with the Engineer Nzioka. Over to you.
Thank you, Akinyi. You have asked about the capacity gaps that we can be able to identify and how we can be able to have maybe national treasury or other stakeholders coming in. According to the Kenya National Electrification Strategy 2022, we were supposed to have achieved 100% renewable, 100% access to the all Kenyans electrification. But remember, we faced some challenges, one being the pandemic. But besides that, we are now reviewing the energy strategy. And one of the capacity gaps that we've realized is that we developed the electrification strategy, but we were not able to put in place a strategy to mobilize resources to implement the energy strategy, electrification strategy. So one of the gaps that we need to look at is having an elaborate strategy for us to be able to mobilize the resources to be able to implement the strategy. Because with no plan, or now we're going to get the funds to be able to reach 100%. That is a very big gap that we need to address, because the government does not have adequate funds. We are now talking of the private. We are also talking of the development partners and others who can be able to mobilize. But we need to have an elaborate strategy that will help us to achieve 100% renewable. And this has been as a result. It was realized because of the we have been talking about inadequate financial resources, and there's the last presenter stated, you only need to bring the money, and it is totally absorbed in this space, because the demand for energy actually, when we have people who want to bring on board electricity access, energy access in our country, but then the gap is that we do not have enough capital for us to be able to implement projects. And we are not short of technologies, because the technologies are available. We have mapped out the resources. Like, for example, we know that as a country, we have 10,000 megawatts that could be provided of geothermal. We have equally around 10,000. We could have 6,000 megawatts from hydroelectric power generation. Then solar is abundant and wind is abundant. So we have done the maps for the resources, but now it is just the gap is having the capital that we can be able to exploit the resources. In terms of the knowledge that we have, in terms of technological capacity, we are now even exporting technology to other countries around. Skills, for example, in terms of geo-exploration, issue of geothermal, KenGen is spread out to Tanzania and other countries like Ethiopia to to be able to assist those countries to exploit their geothermal. So generally, when it comes to skills, like capacity, we have adequate. And this one you can ask even Engineer Ngala. We're having a lot of our engineers being poached. For example, you've seen Engineer Ngala has been poached by, and a lot of them we have the capacity to be able to undertake most of these projects to be able to be implemented. Thank you.
Thanks, Engineer Nzioka, for the response. The two issues, or three, I think the first one is on, let me begin with the one on critical minerals. I think that's quite a significant issue. The question is how one critical issue that is the use of critical minerals is how do we kindly elaborate more on how feasible this is and how sustainable this will be, especially in the e-mobility sector. Now, we understand that energy access has three imperatives, or at least that's what we call the energy trilemma. That's on energy, One is energy equity or affordability, and two is energy security, and the third limb of this is environmental sustainability. When we discuss energy access, it must necessarily speak to these three tracks. Otherwise, we will then be out of harmony with ourselves, and we end up then in an imbalance. When it comes to critical minerals or materials, if you look at EV batteries right now, the most recent advancements are in lithium-ion batteries. So lithium-ion batteries, you have lithium itself, and then you have the cathode material, which is usually cobalt, iron phosphate. You have manganese. You have many permutations on the cathode material. These materials mostly are mined within the continent, DRC, a bit in Zambia, and of course in China.